I'm Richard Fromewick, and I'm the chair of the Meyer Suozzi English at Klein Tax Certiorari and Condemnation Division. But prior to joining Meyer Suozzi, I was the chair of the Nassau County Tax Certiorari Department, and even before that, assistant chair of the New York City Tax Certiorari Bureau. So I've been around the tax certiorari, this complex question, for many years. Although called tax certiorari, really we're talking about property valuation. The more valuable a property is, the higher the assessor is going to assess the property. But in most communities, the assessment is only a fraction of the actual market value, and that ratio of assessment to market value will change every year. When you get a chance, take a look at your own tax bill and you'll see that. The assessment multiplied by the taxes, the tax rate, and that'll determine the property taxes that you pay. In Nassau and Suffolk, with more than 100 different school districts, towns, and villages, the identical property with the same assessment in the village of Hempstead will pay a higher tax than a property in the village of Garden City, simply because the tax rate is so much higher in the village of Hempstead. So what does my department do on a daily basis? I'll give you an example. If somebody came in with a 4,000 square foot property, a couple of stores, with a very high tax bill, how do we go about helping them? So we have to determine what the assessment is and if we can lower that assessment. The most important thing on an investment property is the income and the expenses, and that really helps determine the value. But we can't actually do that if there is no income on the property, if the property is owned by somebody and operated by the same person. So what do we do then? So then we have to look at comparable properties, and we look at their income, we look at their assessment, we look to see if there's been any sales, because the sale of a property is also a very good determinant of value. Now, we look at comparables in the same school district. So why do we do that? That's a good question. Because every single school district, town, villages, library district, they all have different tax rates. And there's hundreds of them. So a similar warehouse or a gas station or any kind of a property in the village of Rockville Center, they'll have a different tax than the same property in Floral Park or in Hempstead or in Oyster Bay or in Huntington or in the hundreds of different tax districts in Nassau and Suffolk. So now let's talk about some actual war stories of successful cases. A few years ago, one of our doctor clients came to us. He owned a very large house in Nassau County, and he was paying over $30,000 in taxes, which was literally twice as much as the other houses on the same block. So we looked at the property, we made an actual inspection, and I noticed that on the side of his house there was a big porch and an entranceway. Now the entranceway was to the upstairs, which was a residence, and the doctor used most of the first floor for his medical practice. But the entire building was assessed as a commercial property. Now once we had discovered that porch and the upstairs, we were able to go to the assessor and we proved that only 40% of the building was commercial and 60% of the building was residential. Well, needless to say, we made a protest, we made a complaint, we had a hearing, and we were successful. There was not only a refund, but there was a lowering of the assessment by over 40%. Now, another property had a very large parking lot that was next to a restaurant. They were on two different lots. The restaurant tax lot had a fairly low tax. In fact, we decided, let's not complain about this tax lot because the taxes are pretty low. But the vacant land that he used as parking had a very, very high tax. And that was because it had frontage on Old Country Road. So we brought the assessor down and we showed them that that vacant land, even though it had access to Old Country Road, couldn't be used for anything because under the zoning, it had to be used for parking for the restaurant. So again, we got a very substantial reduction of over 60% on that vacant land parking. Now, another case that we had in Suffolk was a very large warehouse built around 1940, and it was used to build enormous airplane parts, and there was over 30 feet clear to the roof. But since 2000, the building was used only for assembly of small parts. In fact, there were a few dozen tables and chairs, and people were sitting at them, and all they really needed was a 12-foot span, not 30 feet, and that 30 feet had an enormous cost for air conditioning and for heating. So once we proved that to the assessor, he accompanied us as we did our inspection, we were able to get the entire property reduced by over 35% because so much of it was useless. Now, one more story, which is really my favorite because it was a good friend of mine who owned a house in the city of Woodmere, the village of Woodmere. But when we went to a hearing, I was able to prove that he really lived in the village of Valley Stream. Woodmere was only the mailing address, but his tax lot, his tax payments, and even where his kids went to school was in Valley Stream. Now, the assessor's representative brought comparable properties in Woodmere, which is one of the affluent 5 towns in Nassau County in the southwest portion. Well, the hearing officer very quickly realized that this is a Valley Stream property, not a Woodmere property. So only our comparables were used. All of the assessor's comparables were thrown out as not being in the right area, and we received a complete reduction based on our appraisal because all of our comparables were in the correct village. So, what does this say? Well, there are many hundreds of successful cases that the team at Meyer Suozzi has accomplished over the years. We've reduced commercial and residential properties, and sometimes we even correct mistakes. Yes, the assessors sometimes make mistakes. One of my favorites is the client who came in and said, I'm paying so much more than other properties in the neighborhood. And I found out he was paying on a 3-acre parcel, but he only had 1/3 of an acre. So it was a very tiny typographical error on the assessor's records, but a tremendous tax burden for the client. Now, another common mistake is on homes. So we had a client who came in and it looked like he had a 3-story house with over 6,000 square feet of livable space. But when we made our inspection, we saw that it was really a 2-story house with an uninhabitable attic, and he only had about 4,500 square feet of usable space. So we were able to get a reduction the next year. It's very, very difficult to get a reduction the same year you find a mistake because you have to give the assessor the opportunity by filing a protest for them to correct their errors. Now, here's a useful tip. Let's say you're thinking of buying a property. Always check the assessment. If the assessment is much lower than what you're paying for the house or the commercial property, you may get an increase. And if the assessment is much higher than what you're paying for the house, then you're probably going to get an assessment reduction the next year. And also check the assessor's inventory. So one example is a friend bought a house and the assessment showed a large swimming pool in the backyard, but there was no swimming pool. It had been paved over several years before. So we were able to make that correction, and when he bought the house, the assessment was much lower. So what's the moral of all of these stories? It's a simple one. You have to check your assessment every single year. Why? Because the economy changes, values change. Look what happened in COVID. Finally, you have to check your assessment because towns and villages and counties change the ratio of assessment to market value, and they revalue the property. That's what happened in 2000 in Nassau County. All of the properties were revalued and new ratios were created. So it's important to check your assessment and check it with somebody who knows what they're doing, not at any of these fly-by-night outfits. Check with somebody who knows what they're doing. And remember, be on guard because the assessor is not your friend. So thank you for tuning in. Goodbye and good luck.